Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this latest digital acceleration event, a customer spotlight of the work that we're doing with Yale University and their cross collections work that they're doing. We're joined today with James Cahill, who's one of the account executives, and a couple of members from Yale University, and one of our technical solutions experts is going to be on the call as well today. Just wanted to say just a bit of housekeeping. If your quality is not that good, there's a little cog button that you can press, and you can select 1080p to make sure that we're all looking as fresh as we can. And just before I introduce the speakers, we have announced yesterday that MarkLogic 11 will be launching on the 15th of December, and we have a special and one of our last launch events of the year. We're going to be joined by our CEO and other members of our executive team, and we're going to be having a lively discussion about MarkLogic 11 and the future of MarkLogic and the data platform itself. So, without further ado, I will transfer you to Mr. James Cahill. James.
Great. Thanks, Phil. Hey, everyone. And again, welcome to today's MarkLogic webinar. Again, my name is James Cahill. I am a senior account manager for our public sector and education team here at MarkLogic. I'm joined by Phil, who you just met, as well as Rob Sanderson, Cultural Heritage Metadata Director at Yale, as well as Jeff Campbell, who is Associate IT Director at Yale, and Brent Hartwig, who is one of our consultants who is working on the Yale project. The focus on this session is going to be a MarkLogic customer spotlight, in which Rob will share with us the innovative work he's doing at Yale on their Lux cross collection discovery project, which I've had the pleasure of working alongside them with. So getting into some slides here. Before I let Rob take it away, we do have a lot of new names in today's audience. So I wanted to just give a quick refresher on MarkLogic and what we're all about. So as a business, MarkLogic is a software company, and in 3 words, we simplify complex data. So our mission is to unlock data value for accurate, insightful decision-making by providing a single data platform that solves complex data problems and delivers data agility, enabling all information services to respond nimbly to business changes. So how does the MarkLogic data platform do that? We do that by offering a set of capabilities that fall under our 3 primary tenets. The first of which is 1, connecting to any data source to immediately index and ingest that data, regardless of the data format, application, or architecture. Second, we rapidly create value in that data by curating it through a series of tooling such as enrichment and mastering. And then third, we enable consumption of that data through different lenses based on your use case, whether that's a Google-like search application, similar to what we'll see today, whether that's an analytics or BI application, or a contextualized transactional run the business application. So not only does MarkLogic power applications at universities like Yale, but also hundreds of businesses ranging from financial and pharmaceutical, Fortune 500 companies, to DoD and federal, civilian, state, and local government agencies. So what is the secret sauce of the MarkLogic data platform that you'll hear today? And the short answer is it's the MarkLogic database, which is an enterprise multi-model database that combines documents, metadata, semantic graph, SQL, and search capabilities into a single platform, saving you time on systems integration and simplifying development, scaling, and product support, ultimately allowing your organization to focus your time on getting it right rather than just getting it to work. So I'll keep it short and sweet, and we will pass it to Rob.
Great, thank you. So let me try and share my screen. And hopefully now you should be seeing my slides. So yeah, thank you, James. Thank you, Phil. Yeah, thank you to MarkLogic for the opportunity to use their platform to reach out to folks who, as a higher ed institution, may not otherwise normally get access to. As a not-for-profit, this is not an endorsement of MarkLogic, but we're very grateful for the opportunity to share our joint successes through this channel. So today we're going to talk about Lux and both the process, the technology, have a demo of what we've been able to achieve with the help of MarkLogic to connect together our various cultural heritage units at the university. So we have 4 primary cultural heritage units: the Yale Centre for British Art, the Yale University Art Gallery, the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, and the Yale University Library, all of which have various departments. They're of different sizes, different scales, and so forth. However, unfortunately at the moment, the dinosaurs at the Peabody look more like this, in that it is under renovation, due to be reopened to the public next year. So, a question that has long troubled us, and indeed most cultural heritage organisations, is where do I go to engage with the cultural heritage that Yale curates, given that we have multiple departments, each of which has their own website, they're not connected together, and so forth. They all have different standards, they have different domains, patterns, paradigms, and so forth. What we decided that we wanted was a single environment for discovery and hopefully also for research using that cultural heritage. So this is not new, of course. We've, like many organisations, have wanted this for a long time, and there was a previous effort, ODAI, back in 2009, that allowed you to search using a Solr-based platform across 1.5 million records and 250,000 digital assets. It languished somewhat because of the lack of technical infrastructure, somewhat to do with organisational shifting priorities. So then in 2017, with a new CIO, John Barden, we established the Cultural Heritage IT pillar, which then established a commitment to IIIF and other standards, and cemented this desire for cross-collection discovery. In 2020, we were awarded a Andrew W. Mellon Foundation grant to work on reconciliation, which has proved to be essential for the work that you're about to see. As part of this work, we have applied various principles at the cultural level, or institutional culture that is, which I think is worth highlighting up front, because they really inform how Lux works, and some of the core reasons why we needed something that looked an awful lot like MarkLogic in order to be successful. The first one then is that units retain ownership of their data. So Lux is not a system of record. We have not introduced any new systems of record. We do not move the data around. Instead, the units own their systems, and it is their IT folks who look after those systems, who understand their data and can get the knowledge out of their systems and into Lux. Secondly, good enough is better than perfect, because as anyone who has worked with data knows, perfect is not a possibility, and there is always better, more and more accurate data that we could obtain. So instead, the agreement has always been that we will collaboratively across the units and IT work incrementally towards the goals of having a system which is good enough for use, rather than everything being completely error-free. And finally, the acknowledgement and recognition that expertise exists throughout the institution. This is not an ITS project. This is not Office of the Vice Provost where I work. This is not any of the units individually. And this collaboration across the different units and ITS encourages the development of staff, particularly during COVID, when we were not able to work together in person. Having something to focus on that could be done remotely was an enormous benefit. onto some technical principles then. So LUX is loud and not by volume, but as an acronym for linked open usable data. So I'm sure that you've heard of linked open data. But the focus on usability is one that we find to be especially important. Standards are important, and of course there's too many to choose from, particularly when you're spanning the domains of archives, libraries, art museums, and natural history museums. The accurate semantics are important for cross-domain interoperability. We need to know what, who an author is, or what the relationship between a person and an object is as an author, as a creator, as a discoverer, and so forth. So in terms of that usability, we use the JSON LD syntax because that allows our developers to work with the data in its native form, rather than having to transform in and out of different syntaxes. So the baseline that we're using in terms of standards is linked art, that I'll talk about briefly in a minute, and IIIF, the International Image Interoperability Framework for the digital content. So in terms of usability, who is it designed for? Well, it's for data, and hence the person who uses the data is the developers, be that Brent and the other backend developers, or Cameron as one of our front-end developers. That hard-working developer in the middle there then builds the web page or the application, which the end user, say a researcher or student or scholar, will use to interact with the cultural heritage knowledge. So when we talk about usability in loud, it is usability of for a developer rather than for the end user. Another ungoogleable acronym is shared, but it is one that seems to capture all of the useful features of LUX. So S for sustainable, we have shared costs across the different units. And in our next phase, we'll be working to integrate services both into LUX and out of LUX. So using LUX not as a platform, as an application, but instead as a data set that can enable multiple applications to be built on top of it. Harvestable, this is something which we have used throughout the system, as you see in one of the diagrams coming up. So instead of moving the data around, instead we harvest it on a nightly basis, and we will make the data out of LUX harvestable. Available, so open licenses, everything is CC0 for the metadata and CC5 for the images if they are our images, with links to the data and the standards to make it easier to reuse. Reconciled, our entities that we have in the system are aligned across 12 or more different external systems to try to then enrich those descriptions from the external authority's knowledge. And D for diverse, we have made every effort at inclusion and diversity, both from a data perspective as well as from the participants within the project. A couple of points then about our technical processing. So we have a practical approach because we recognized right from the word go that this was an ambitious project. We knew that we needed to try to do something more than just yet another Thor database or yet another Elasticsearch database, but we didn't know whether it would work at the beginning. So we've taken the approach of incremental prototypes to always ensure that if a prototype doesn't work, we can fall back to the previous one that did. As part of that, we try to separate concerns via standards so that if something wasn't working out with, say, IIIF, we could swap in another platform into that slot. And then the collaborative and research-oriented approach has also been extremely valuable. We performed an extensive analysis of more than half a dozen different back-end multimodal or multi-model database solutions before finally settling on MarkLogic. In particular, they had to allow full text searches, graph searches, and hybrid queries that mix together full text and graph. The front end then interacts primarily, as I said before, with the JSON-LD documents, and rather than via custom APIs or via Sparkle, despite Sparkle being a standard. So the model then from sort of 50,000 feet is very straightforward, but it is one which is activity-centric rather than object-centric. So there is who, where, what, when, and how from that activity. The who performed the activity, where did the activity take place, what did the activity take place on, be it a physical or conceptual thing, when did it take place, and how, what techniques or what sort of activity was it. We then take this sort of 50,000 foot view, and when we drill down, we sort of stamp that repeatedly across the landscape and applying it at different layers. So why do we need such a model? Apart from the cross-domain aspect, one of our initial impetuses was to enable not just discovery, but research. So one of the questions that came up in an early 2019 brainstorm was, how did European artists paint the American West during the 1800s? And we quickly realized that to answer this seemingly easy question, we needed to use a knowledge graph rather than just a regular document database. So to take that model then, we have a physical object that shows some visual content which represents a place. It was produced in a production activity which was carried out by the artist. The artist was born in a birth event which took place in a place. So in the case of the picture by Bierstadt of Yosemite Valley, the art gallery's object shows an image which represents Yosemite. It's a painting. It was produced around 1873 and Bierstadt was born in Germany. We can then reconcile those entities with external vocabularies such as the ones at the Getty. So TGN, ULAN, or either AAT or LCSH or other concept ontologies of vocabularies for the types. But it still doesn't get us to answer the question, because we then need to enrich the records from our external authorities to get to Germany as part of Europe, Yosemite as part of California, and California as part of the American Southwest. And it's only at this point, after both reconciling and enriching the data, can we answer that question of how did European artists paint the American West. So how does that enrichment and reconciling work? So although MarkLogic does have products in the space, we decided that we would go alone to some degree and built a data ETL pipeline that looks like this. So a scheduler runs which nightly harvests records from our units. And so we have two different instances of TMS, Museum System, one of EMU at the Peabody, Voyager at the library, and Archospace at the library. The units then provide the changes of the last 24 hours via an activity stream, which is the AAA change discovery, which then gives us access to all of the change records which get cached in the pipeline. We also then harvest or load from data dumps the Getty vocabularies, Library of Congress vocabularies, and thank you, Library of Congress folks, for your assistance over the years with LC, NAF, and LCSH. OCLC, Wikidata, some national libraries, including the German National Library, French National Library, National Library of Japan, and places we use geonames and his own. This will be expanded as new sources become useful and available. So, of course, these data sets are not in the same model as our internal data, so we map the raw data into that model. At the same time, we build reconciliation indexes of names and identifiers so that this reconcile process here can build a big map about 98 million URIs in it at the moment, of all of the identifiers that identify the same thing. We then have a process which goes through all of our internal records, all of the external records, and rewrites them such that they use a single set of identifiers from the map. We then merge across all of our internal and external sources those records that identify or describe the same entity, which are then cached, exported, and then loaded into MarkLogic for use. So at this point, let us take a look at where we are with our product. So as you can see, I will highlight up front, this is still in beta. It is not launched. We are still actively working on things, including advanced search, but we are very encouraged by the way that we've been able to get our initial prototypes in advanced search to work. So let's just search for Humble. And as you can see, we have 6 different tabs across the top. So objects, which are physical or digital things, mostly physical that you can hold in your hand. Works, which are archives or library records. And here's the archives of John Trumbull. People and groups. So Alice Mason shows up first. Trumbull was her maiden name. But yeah, Robert Trumbull. Places, if you know Connecticut, you'll know that there is Trumbull in Fairfield County, but there's also Trumbull County in Ohio. Concepts, excuse me, primarily from the Library of Congress in this case, but yeah, various Trumbull-related concepts. And the 5 events are exhibitions. So we can then do faceting on the results per tab. So perhaps we're interested in the objects, we can facet based on different types. So I'll come back to the visual artworks, but let's briefly take a look at the animal specimens from the Peabody. So here is a bunch of specimens which have been discovered in Trumbull rather than objects created by Trumbull. So let's just go back and look at the visual artworks. So Trumbull is a well-known painter, John Trumbull. Particularly, I would say, at least in our collection, he has a lot of miniatures. With 70 such miniatures. And so as you can see, we can facet very quickly, as you would expect. We can also facet based on the other types of relationship, other types of predicate in the system. There's lots of oil paint and wood, but there's also ivory and watercolor. Let's look at the ivory ones. So what you'll notice is that the objects are produced not by Trumbull now, that we've selected ivory, but instead by other people. So let's just keep that in mind for later. Let's look at this one, John Trumbull. So here's an object record. It's this miniature of John Trumbull. This is AAAF. You can do deep zoom and so. The tombstone record, or the base metadata, what sort of thing is it? It's a miniature, it's a portrait, it's on ivory, it's watercolor, it's made by Ann Hall in New York, and so forth. Of course, this is in the art gallery. We could click here to go and look at the home page for the object in the gallery itself. The image, though, is about or represents Trumbull, the person. So here is our page for Trumbull, which also then is divided up into tabs. The left-hand side is designed to bring you back into the collection from these sort of entity pages of people, groups, places, and concepts, either to objects, to works that were created or published by the person, or works about the person. We have then timelines as visualizations, and yes, this is not a timeline; it's a bar chart with still working on some of the visualizations, but you do get a sense of when Trimble was active. The map is also just a list at the moment, but that would be a map at that point. Related agents. So Trimble was active at the time of the revolution. So common agents are George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so forth. Related subjects, as you would expect, United States History Revolution, painting American exhibitions, Benjamin Franklin, and so on and so forth. Related materials, which is why I said to keep note of the ivory. Note that the materials related to Trimble the person, none of which are ivory. Right? So Trimble primarily works with oil paint on wood, also graphite and linen, which is canvas. So we haven't looked at a place yet. Let's go back up. So this this right-hand side is about the person. Sorry, I should show you one of these things. So we can, of course, go in and look at all of the results of those queries. So here's the 129 Trimble and oil paint objects. Or we could go and see all 245 objects created by Trimble, and so on and so forth. Yeah, the left-hand side brings you back into the collection. The right-hand side tells you more about what you're looking at. So this is one of our self-portraits of Trimble. This data, of course, we do not have all of these names in our records. They come from the enriched external sources, and I won't keep clicking show more. But yes, we have lots. Birthplace, death place, roles, gender, occupation, member of groups, and so on and so forth. Okay, moving on briefly. So places like people, instead of having a picture, have a map, as you would expect. The left-hand side is trying to bring you back into the collection. We can then explore who was born here, who died here, and so forth. What are the related concepts? It turns out for Lebanon, the related concepts is governors. And let's look at the concept page briefly. So again, left-hand side brings you back into the collection. Right-hand side is about the topic. This widget also is still being developed, but it's a tree that lets you climb up the hierarchy or down the hierarchy with the same other widgets of timelines, related locations, related people, and so forth. You could then go back further and see who are all of the governors, 1831. And this is not a system which is around governors. This is something that comes out of having an extensive cultural heritage collection. We have a lot of information about a lot of people. But one of the interesting things then, we can facet based on other features of the people, so governors who are also diplomats, say, or governors who were members of particular parties, and so forth. And this one at random. And now we've gone far afield from our original search. But note, we've not done any other searches by hand. All we've done is click through, trying to explore around looking at information that's presented rather than having to sort of jump out, jump back, jump out, jump back from searches. Right, so that away. Okay, so come back to my slides. So what are the takeaways that we've come to at this point? So the first one I would say is that Lux is a knowledge graph, and more like the web than like a database. Right? We did one search, Trimble, and found ourselves off exploring governors because it turned out that there was multiple governors who came from the little town of Lebanon in Connecticut, where Trimble came from. So everything is connected. That's the advantage of linked open data. We have all of the expected search features that you would get with a traditional document-based application, but augmented by these useful graph features that allow us to explore the relationships between the records in the system and cross over records in the system, rather than just doing a single search one by one by one. So we think that this starts to shift the paradigm of interacting with our data from a sort of known item search, where you go to the library database, you search for the book that you want, and you find out where it is on the shelf, to one of a browsing, exploring, and discovering. And we want to encourage people to be curious and to investigate areas that they may not have known about, that they may not have initially thought to, because that surely is the way that we bring people towards cultural research from the sort of more vanilla known item search paradigm. However, to get those links, reconciliation is absolutely critical. The connections across the collections requires there to be a single entry for Trimble rather than to have one entry per dataset. That also allows that enrichment from the external sources to happen, which gives us the birth date, birthplace, death place, the fact that he was a member of the National Academy of Sciences, that he was a governor, and so on and so forth. An interesting thing to have noted is that the richer records are more relevant, e.g. the enriched records are more relevant, and then rank higher in search due to two things. One, they are more highly connected, and we can have our relevance take into account connected records. And by enriching the records directly, they have more text, and hence a normal keyword relevance algorithm will also rank them higher. This then improves the user experience because those richer records rank higher in the search, which then are seen by more people more often. Some challenges though. Cross-domain, as you can imagine, is hard, particularly because the different domains have very different descriptive practices. Museums have a tendency to describe the object that they can hold in their hand or is on the wall. Libraries tend to describe the work because unless it's a particularly famous student who has scrawled in the margins of Philosophy 101 textbook, the fact that someone has written in the textbook on one of 20 copies is not particularly useful, rather than that they have the textbook at all. And archives tend to describe the collections rather than the individual objects in the archive, frequently due to lack of resources and time. So in order to have the descriptions be coherent, you need to have a core ontology that we can profile and clarify and extend as needed, that doesn't force us into any one of those three patterns, but allows us to describe all of them in a coherent way. And yes, the individual domains still expect some degree of domain specificity, even when aggregated together. It can't be completely wrong. We can't simplify it to the point of being inaccurate. And that's why we went with linked art and Side-up CRM. Also, excuse me 1 second. Labels are traditionally used as identifiers, particularly as concepts. But in linked data, URIs are, of course, the identifiers. So there is a bit of a mental shift for domain practitioners to think about things, the actual object, the actual work, the actual archive, the person, the place, rather than the strings which are used to label them. And this labeling pattern that has been in place, of course, for decades, centuries even, produces some interesting cross-domain issues with reconciliation, such as landscapes, the type of artwork, was reconciled automatically with the term ecological zones, which, fair enough, a landscape is an ecological zone from a natural history perspective. But to say that this late 18th century Japanese scroll is an ecological zone is stretching it just a little bit far. Resources are definitely needed. Trailblazing is a costly exercise, particularly in terms of staff time. We've had many committees meet weekly over the past 3 years now. And Jeff's team is dedicated pretty much entirely to Lux over that time. Licenses and infrastructure, both in terms of MarkLogic, but also just the cloud infrastructure and so on needed to run it, can be costly. Professional services, we would be nowhere if we did not have Brent as part of the team, working to ensure that we are using MarkLogic the way that it should be used, rather than how we might naively expect it to be used. Time, so not just for understanding how to work with a new product, but also discussing what should we do? What is this new system? What is this new paradigm that we're trying to trailblaze towards? But we do like to hope that by laying this path, that we'll be reducing the cost for others to follow in this direction. And for this photo from the art gallery, there have been a lot of flowers along the way that we can stop and look at and admire, and expect there to be many more. In terms of MarkLogic performance and optimization and development, the first thing that we had to really look at was how could we do this multi-model query approach, because there's the Optic API, there's Sparkle, there's CTS, and there's a lot of flexibility, which means there's a lot of research that needs to be done in order to figure out the most appropriate way to go. So with our sort of prototype and experiment pattern, we started off with Sparkle queries, but of course Sparkle doesn't really support full text search. We tried again just using vanilla CTS, which is excellent for full text search, but doesn't, in the way that we were using it at the time, give us the cross-record capabilities. We then came a lot closer to our final version by moving to the new Optic API that allows Sparkle queries and CTS queries and triple patterns and so forth to be merged together within the API to produce tabular results that can then be turned into the search results. But we found, after some engagement with engineering, that the particular pattern that gave us our nice full color finished version was CTS again, using a couple of functions, triple range query and triples, in a very particular way that lets us get access to the triple store or the triple index, and still have all of the fast access to facets and full text search of CTS. So the takeaway then, it's very flexible, there's lots of options, it takes time to do the research, but the results are definitely worth it, as hopefully you would agree from the demo that you've seen so far. There's also a lot of optimization that can happen at the data side, even maintaining the standards and so forth. One thing that we found early on to be absolutely critical was that the document ID of the record in the database should be the IRI of the root of the graph that the document contains, because this lets us use the new CTS IRI reference function, which produces an IRI, e.g. the form that could be compared with the outcome of the triples of the document. So that lets us do the merge between the full text searches of the documents and the graph searches of the triples in an extremely performant way. We denormalize triples right at the last in the last step of the pipeline in order to reduce the number of joins that have to take place at query time. This also greatly improved performance and allows us to do what I call semantic zooming, where you can go from is there any relationship between these two records to is there a creator-like relationship between these two records to is there a painter relationship between these two records, e.g. is this person the person who painted this object or had the role of painter in the creation of the object. The managed and unmanaged triples capabilities of MarkLogic are also very important when you're deleting records. So one of the aspects of having multiple systems, say Elasticsearch and Neptune, would be when you delete a document out of Elasticsearch, you would also need to delete the triples out of Neptune. However, those are not tied together, at least in our experience. Whereas in MarkLogic, by putting the triples into the document, when you delete the documents, you delete the triples if there aren't other documents that also have those. Then in terms of optimizing the queries, the query plan viewer and the monitoring console were extremely useful functionality, especially being able to work with engineering, thanks especially to John Snelson, helping us to understand where we would get the best performance. What should we be aiming for in those queries? It has proven to be very scalable and flexible for us. At the moment, we run 3-node clusters in AWS, but equally it runs on our software engineers' laptops. We could have a single cluster of more than 3 nodes and so forth. It's very easy to automate tasks in a variety of languages. We have some Python implementations. We use Gradle and JavaScript and so forth. The configuration of the system is also very easy. You can do it by hand with the admin console. You can set it up with configurations in GitHub and then configure it via Gradle. There's many different ways you can install it, and it seems to, and from our perspective, to make a very efficient use of all of the available resources across the cluster, including memory, CPU, and disk. One of the other systems that we were looking at, that I won't name, of course, when we were doing our analysis before selecting MarkLogic, was extremely fast, but relied entirely on memory. So if you had lots of disk space, it really didn't make any difference. You had to load every single triple into memory for it to work. And it was very good, but it would have meant that as we tried to scale out, we would need increasingly expensive machines to work with. In that we have 860 gigabytes of JSON-LD going into MarkLogic, which would cost a lot in AWS memory terms. So some known unknowns at this point. The extent of adoption, Lux is still being developed and tested. There's still some functionality to be added, such as advanced search. We do expect to launch in the spring, sometime sort of April-ish. And there is the challenges of a new site, particularly when there's existing sites where you can find at least some of the information. But as you've seen, it's also a bit of a new paradigm in terms of explore and browse and discover rather than no-nothing search. But given that, what is intuitive and at the same time innovative, that will then ensure adoption and use. And then the ease of sustainability is another known unknown. Is it mission critical? We think so from our division as in cultural heritage. But there's shared costs there is a lot of cost which can be shared, and there's a lot of automation that can happen. Our next phase, as I mentioned earlier, is to use the dataset as a service rather than as an application, and allow the units or anyone to build other applications. We already have a couple of units who have signed up essentially to say that they want to use the Lux data for their specific collection sites because it's better than their own system. So that's hopeful for sustainability. It's critical to the mission of the units, that their objects are well described and easily discoverable, at which point Lux is easier to justify. So the conclusion is essentially that MarkLogic was really the only solution that we could find that solved our core challenge, which was merging full text and graph queries in a performant way and in a usable way that enables discovery and heading towards cultural research. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. And hopefully you've all been putting questions into the chat box. And go to them.
Yeah, Rob, thank you very much for that. It was a great presentation. Really interesting to see what you guys are really innovating in the space that you're in. We do have some questions, so if you haven't spoken on the call already, but I'll call on your name to maybe answer some of these questions, then just introduce yourself. But we're joined today by a couple of people from Yale and a couple more from MarkLogic. I'll go with the first question that we had, which was for enriching your load. For enriching, you're loading a lot of external data sets. Are these copies really necessary? Aren't the external identifiers, the URIs, enough for answering research questions?
Yep. So, in terms of performance, yes, Wikidata, we load all of Wikidata, not into MarkLogic, just in a Postgres cache. We load all of the Library of Congress Name Authority file. We load all of the dozens of different external authorities. But disk is cheap. And query time, the user's time is the most precious commodity. So by loading all of these external datasets completely, doing the reconciliation up front, and enriching the records within MarkLogic, it means that we can have a much more performant system, and we save the users time in that they don't have to wait for the system to do a federated query across multiple systems. So yes, in the ideal world where all systems are always online, that Sparkle worked perfectly every time, that it was never down. And yes, you can see everyone grinning because you know that people are using your Sparkle endpoint when it's down. So yes, it's technically it would be sufficient, but in practice it's not. We need to have a single system that can do the graph plus query, graph plus full text searches in order to provide the user experience that we want to.
Yeah, and I think both have various different advantages for various different use cases, and I think your use case is a great example where you're going to bring that together in one central database. You're going to have all of your data in one place and be able to query that data. Like say with URIs, you can do that the other way around, but like say for your system, I can definitely see why you chose that path. Second question, what differentiates an object from a work, and is there a reason for this distinction? I think we've definitely got some users from the questions on the call here, future users of the system.
Yep. So an object in our parlance at the moment is a physical thing that you could touch, but please don't for the painting and so on. And a work is the intellectual work. So the distinction really comes from the museum versus library traditions, where the museums catalog the thing on the wall, and the library catalogs the work and doesn't actually, a lot of the time, care that they have 20 copies of it sitting on a shelf. So this matters when we have works described by museums and objects described by libraries. because they have different degrees of description and different cataloging practices. However, we do fully recognize that the distinction is not one that users necessarily need to be required to understand to use the system. And we're looking at whether it's possible to merge the objects and works tabs in the results page down to a single one and provide a user interface that can mediate between them in a bit more fluent way.
Okay.
That one last point on that one. The issue is there are objects that contain multiple works and sometimes a huge number. I think the highest in our system is 140 different works in a single object, which if you imagine a single record view with a physical thing that carries 140 different works, each described reasonably thoroughly, that would be a very long page. Yeah. It's even worse the other way around. There is 530 carriers of a single work, being the reports of the special sessions of the United Nations. So yeah, it's a user interface challenge as well as a query performance challenge to merge across them.
And what types of user evaluation did the team do with the interface and the discoverability? I think from a development point of view, I think that's quite interesting to our audience here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have on the schedule, once advanced search is complete, to do a series of user evaluations. We have done some so far, but we haven't done a significant number. Spanning students, faculty, and the community, people within the units, and so forth. At the moment, we've done sort of hand-holding exercises where a new user sits down with our UI UX folks, and they go through some tasks, and they're observed trying to do those queries and to see where the unintuitive parts are. Where do they get stuck? And yes, the object work one has come up repeatedly with in those experiments.
I would add that that as part of the development process, that we made extensive use of wireframes, and we did do a fair bit of usability testing against the wireframes, but that was focused primarily on project staff. There's a rather large, as part of the collaboration, there's a rather large group of stakeholders that we're working with and engaged with regularly.
Yeah, and hopefully, I mean, there's a question in there that said, when do you go live? I think you said it was spring this year in the presentation. But who's the audience for this application? Is it somebody that just has an interest in these pieces of work, or is it, are you really targeting academics and the academic community, or is it wider than that?
Yeah, I think we would like it to be wider. Of course, as a higher ed institution, our primary audience is researchers and scholars and students, teaching and learning, and so forth. But equally, if you're anywhere in the world and you want to engage with art and cultural heritage generally, we hope that the Lux platform would be interesting and informative. So one of the hardest tasks that I've ever had to do in my career is try to work with a single set of data and a single user interface that can be usable and interesting and enjoyable to both scholars who are experts in the domain and novices who just essentially walk off the street and are interested and want to perhaps in the future become an expert. But right now they know what they like, and they want to see more of what they like, as opposed to the expert who I know about such and such and such and such, and oh look, yes, that's totally expected that John Trumbull didn't use ivory because blah 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 blah, right? Yeah. So that's always hard. We would like to think we are heading in the right direction, by moving towards the sort of explore and discover and curiosity-driven approach, rather than a known item search. You go to the search, you see the results, you go back to the search, you go back to the search, you go back to the search, and so forth.
Yeah, I think that's the the democratization of education and things like that. I think that this will play a good part in that. If someone uses one of these resources to research, how do they cite? Is there a cite this button? I think this might be from a future user, but let's.
There isn't a cite this, but it is in the wireframes. It's another thing that we'll be adding.
Coming down the line.
Along with a share this. I realize we're now in the post-Twitter world, but yes, via social media and so on. A share this, a cite this, and so on.
But also each of the links, each of the objects, for example, does point back to the system of record, and those systems of record have a citing capability.
Okay. All right. Well, yeah, that's great. I think, like I say, I can see some questions from future users in here as much as I can see people who want to build the thing. Another question is quite interesting, and you might want to involve Brent in this, but do you have in-house MarkLogic developers and admins at Yale's, or are those functions provided by consultants?
My team is part of Central ITS, and my team is specifically dedicated to supporting our cultural heritage organizations. So where there are common needs, common systems, we get involved. So we are essentially the technical stakeholder on this project, and will be the technical owners of the MarkLogic implementation. This is the first implementation of MarkLogic here at Yale. So my team does have a sysadmin who has been spending much of their time gaining familiarity and experience with MarkLogic, along with a back-end developer and a tech lead, in addition to a front-end developer.
Yeah, and I guess they've all been working with Brent to kind of bring that all together and sort of build their knowledge as they develop, as it were.
Yeah, a very important part of the collaboration and the engagement with MarkLogic has been knowledge transfer, and has been the very painful recognition that at some point Brent and the MarkLogic professional services team will no longer be an active part of our team. But as part of that, we are, in addition to working with Brent, we're also working through support. We're also working, through KBs and things like that, in order to ensure that we've got our own skill set coming up to speed, and we'll be able to walk when Brent runs.
Well, hopefully you can keep him on your Christmas card list. And I think he'll still be around for that. Moving on to another question now. We've only got a few minutes left, and I said before we wouldn't take up too much time, but we'll try and squeeze these questions in into maybe we'll run over by 5 minutes, but let's see what we can do. It's my understanding that you decided not to provide APIs. If so, would this limit the possible interaction tools that could be developed to explore the data and generate storytelling tools? Can you expand on the decision-making process where behind the facilitation of an API within this pipeline?
Yep, that's in our next post-launch phase. So phase 2 is, instead of having Lux, the application, is to provide Lux, the service platform. Yeah. Some of the rationale, some of the decision making. So we are not providing a Sparkle API because of the performance implications. However, for the graph queries we know to be useful, we can provide more of a hypertext as the application, as the engine of application state type approach, or REST, if you don't like Catios, whereby there is a URI that is advertised which performs the query relative to a particular resource. So we hope that more applications will be built on top of the data. And yeah, the next phase, starting in sort of June next year, will be to make that happen or make that possible, rather than now.
The experience must be quite good, because I think you said you had already 2 units wanting to get access to that data set. So, yeah, congratulations on doing that. That's some early praise there for that system. Did you develop any ontologies, or were they already constructed for you? It assumes that your knowledge of the knowledge graph was only possible when ontologies were constructed and actively engaged. Is this right?
Yep. Yes. So in other slide decks, I have a couple of slides sort of laying out all of the dependencies, but we use the museum sector's conceptual reference model, which is the International Council of Museums Subcommittee on Documentation. So it is a way to think about the world. It is then expressed in an RDF-S ontology, and then we use terms from the various vocabularies, such as AAT or LCSH, to make the ontology more specific, to be more specific to the domain.
Yeah.
So there are still a few areas in which we needed to create our own predicates and classes, but by and large, the community standards were sufficient, and we have done our very best to stick to those standards wherever possible, because that will then be a mitigation should we ever need to change systems or change models or add new units or new data sets.
It makes it more agile further down the road.
Yep.
Yeah. Great. And then we'll do 2 more questions, so we'll wrap up then. Do you think the UI of a shared discovery system deprioritizes surfacing archival metadata for users, i.e. these records may be hidden in a concepts facet where the data just doesn't really exist in the same consistent way it does for library records?
Yeah. Yes, that's an interesting one. So thankfully at Yale, our at least the higher levels of the archives have been described using archive space to reference places and people and concepts in a reasonably consistent way. So by reconciling, John Trumbull, we can get from the John Trumbull page, say you've gotten there from one of his objects, we can make sure that the user knows that we have also got his archives, and it's in those tabs on the left-hand side. So there is always the unlovely garbage in, garbage out case where if you put in something which doesn't have much information, then yes, it's not going to get surfaced as often as a record which has a lot. But we have done our level best to be diverse, the D in shared, and ensure that all of the units, regardless of their size or the types of metadata, do get some degree of equal footing, equal exposure, via the tweaking to the relevancy and ensuring that the UI can foreground things which wouldn't otherwise necessarily be seen.
Great. Well, one last question then, before we finish. But I think you've done a good job from promoting this by the looks of things, because it is. Is there a preview or a beta version of the Lux Online that we could have a look at? Are there any plans to maybe address that later?
Yeah. So there is, but could you email if you're interested? So what we would be interested in is getting feedback on it before launch. What we are not interested in is having everyone use it before launch while we are still working on it. So if you are interested in exploring further, hopefully with the opportunity to tell us what you like and what you don't like, please do email me, robert.sanderson@yale.edu, and we're happy to provide you a link. to the site to look at. But yeah, launch will be completely open, and there's no user accounts needed. There's no you don't have to be a member of Yale or anything. So in the spring of next year, it'll all be open. But yes, if you would like to explore further and give us some feedback, do send an email. We're happy to give you that link.
Yeah, and if you've got any questions for these gentlemen, then please do email them. Email addresses in the presentation. We'll try and get a slide deck up online that'll have their contact details in as well. Love to get those conversations going with the MarkLogic community, the academic community. Really build on top of the success of this. Thank you, Robert and Jeffrey. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brent and James, for pulling these two into this. It's been a really interesting discussion we've had. I think this is the most questions that we've had in a while, and certainly the most detailed questions we've had on somebody's initiative. So I think that's gone down quite well. Last but not least, as we mentioned, we do have MarkLogic 11. It is launching on the 15th at 4 p.m. GMT. That's 11 a.m. Eastern time. We'll be joined by our CEO, Jeff Casale, and members of the management team to go over the latest features in MarkLogic and the direction that we're taking our data platform in. Once again, thanks to all the speakers. Thanks for staying on for a bit longer today, and we'll see you again soon with another DA event shortly. Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.